right, good afternoon, everyone, or I'm sorry, good morning. We're going to get started with a set of two half-hour conversations that do a deeper dive into aspects of the Texas Metropolitan Blueprint. I want to introduce our two panelists. Pablo Pinto, who joined us this morning on stage, a professor at the University of Houston Hobby School of Public Affairs and director of the Hobby School Center for Public Policy. And he's joined by Maria Perez, research associate at the Hobby School of Public Affairs, also an author of the Texas Metropolitan Blueprint. With moderator Matthew Watkins, our editor-in-chief for the Texas Tribune, we're going to dive into issues of climate resilience for the state's cities and developing better tools to identify and address the risks affecting Texas's most vulnerable populations. And with that, I turn the program over to Matthew.
All right, thank you, Matt. Thank you for both for being here. So this is a conversation about climate resiliency. It's no secret that natural disasters in this state are frequent and perhaps getting more frequent. We are in a city here where that is no surprise to anyone. I want to just start with sort of a broad question of just tell me right now how set up we are as a world, as a state, as the various cities in this state for what's happening and what's going to happen with regard to these, oncoming disasters of the next half century. Give me your broad outlook before we go into the details here.
So you want the short or the long version? I mean, it's like
your choice.
The short version is we're not ready. I mean, that's the first one. The long version is there's a lot of variability across different communities and populations in terms of, first, their exposure to natural disasters, and extreme weather events, but other types of shocks as well. I mean, it's like, so the exposure is one, right? So the second is how vulnerable populations are. There's also large variance across that. I mean, different populations have higher levels of vulnerability to natural disasters. I mean, it's like, and for some, I mean, it's like all natural disasters hit them the same way. For others, it depends on the type of disaster and shock, right? The second component of this is resiliency. I mean, it's like that's also very different. So you might be exposed to many, it's like extreme weather events or natural disasters and get back on your feet. I mean, it's like, right? And that's related to this idea of adaptability, which is another element that we looked. I mean, it's like what's the adaptive capacity of our, communities and individuals and households. I mean, it's like to that. And the last one is preparedness. I mean, it's like, right? I mean, it's like, and all of them hit, it's like different communities and populations differently. Some populations are better, dealing with that. It's like some communities are tighter together. And this is a space we've been doing a lot of research. It's like, and Maria Paula leads our effort at the Hobby School to do that type of research. But the idea here is that events that look extreme, and rare, in the past are becoming more often. So your 500-year flood event became a 100-year flood event. Your 100-year flood event became a 10-year flood event, right? And it's reflected in the maps that FEMA and others are building. And so the key here is how do we respond to that? How we prepare people, it's like for what will keep coming to us. And it's not just flooding, it's like, so we did a study a few years ago. Actually, last year, 2024, we released this report. And it shows that we went through a survey of Texans and asking about for the past 20 years, it's like FEMA declared natural disasters in the state of Texas, and 74% of respondents experienced at least one of these natural disasters. It varies by region and zones, depending on the events, but these are issues that are extreme weather event, cold and heat, right? Flooding, wind, it's like, and even other types of disasters.
So you say 74%, that is obviously a lot of people. And one of the things I pulled or noticed from this blueprint that we've been talking about today is more frequent and intense natural disasters. Policy interventions are needed to reallocate scarce resources to vulnerable places. What I mean, what I'm sort of gathering, and I want you to tell me whether I'm reading this correctly, is sort of an acknowledgement that due to the frequency, due to the amount of needs and the amount of vulnerabilities in the state, that we might not have all the resources we need to be prepared for this, and therefore we need to be targeting them to the most vulnerable places. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, that's exactly what we go to with our type of research, and what we have found in surveys is that we need to allocate resources differently according to the community, to the specific needs, and very localizedly. So, for example, we found that people in Texas are prepared and are preparing even more as they have to face more disasters. So, for example, Houstonians tend to prepare a lot more compared to other places in Texas. And that makes them feel better off in terms of a disaster. But as the severity increases, then they might not be as prepared as they want to be. And this also happens for vulnerable populations or vulnerable neighborhoods or households that have disabled populations, for example, who might be worse off when they face a disaster. And that's why it's also important to understand this and create measures that target this. Yeah.
So I want to make sure we kind of are all clear on the definitions here. When we talk about vulnerable populations, are we talking about populations that, or areas that that there are a lot of natural disaster threats, or are we talking about populations that are vulnerable for other reasons, be it language, economic status, all the different kind of factors like that?
Yeah, it has many dimensions. One is the physical, like being closer to a flood area or living in or housing conditions, which is more related to physical aspects. But there are also dimensions in terms of minority status, language barriers, disabilities, household composition, households that have more children versus less children, households that have elder populations. And so it has different components. And so the more components you have in a community or in a household, of course, the worse off you're going to be and the more vulnerable.
To clarify, one of the dimensions, so the first one, I mean, the proximity to events, we call it risk, right? I mean, it's like, so most of us are, I mean, under risk, I mean, it's like of flooding, right? I mean, it's like strong wind, I mean, it's like fires, right? So that's the risk. I mean, it's like, and for some events, it's becoming more frequent than others. But the vulnerability, as I say, is like condition of being exposed to risk, right? How much does it hurt you? I mean, right? That's kind of the
Right, and of course there's some overlap, right? It is often true that the areas of a town that are most vulnerable to disasters are often inhabited by people with fewer resources, in part because of property values.
That is key for some types of risks. I mean, it's like for others, it's not. I mean, to give you an example from the Houston area. So when Harvey hit Houston, the areas impacted were more impacted by the damage of flooding were to the west of town. Those tend to be the wealthiest and higher income areas of town, right? The east sides of town, I mean, it's like they were not as impacted. They were still impacted. I mean, it's like, right? I mean, 46% of people living in Houston were somehow impacted by Harvey. But if you look at vulnerability and resiliency, individuals on the west side of town, I mean, it's like had more damage, also in value, but they were better able at rebuilding. They had insurance or savings, right? I mean, it's like, or knew how to navigate the system to bounce back. The people on the east side of town, I mean, tending to be more vulnerable due to many conditions, including, I mean, it's like the damage was lower, but their ability to rebuild was also harder. And that's what we were doing to bring the attention, right? That when you allocate resources, it's key to identify not only, I mean, it's like the damage, but also the ability of getting people back on their feet.
So, of course, the ability to identify vulnerable areas requires data, requires information, it requires, forecasting in terms of what kind of disasters an area might be susceptible to. How would y'all classify the quality of the data we have so far at this state right now? Do we have the information we need to make these assessments?
Yes and no. So we have a bunch of publicly available data that can inform us on the different communities. Of coming from different sources. So one of the things we're trying to do at the hobby school is have a dashboard that incorporates all these data sources, so that's easier for policymakers, for the community, to have all in the same place and be able to map everything together and have a better idea of how every community looks like. We're also trying to target this with our surveys that we do at the hobby school, which give us different type of information that complements this publicly available data. So I think overall it's important to complement the data between survey data and publicly available data. And regarding that, I think dashboard is a great tool that we're trying to expand, and also develop measures that include these specific components. For example, for the case of Houston, which is where we started off at the dashboard, we know that, for example, speaking Spanish might not be as much as a barrier to access resources at the time of recovery or help post-disaster as it would be in other places in Texas. So understanding these specific differences and accounting for that in the data, it's important. And yeah, you can...
And to this point, so the CDC has its measure of vulnerability, right? A social vulnerability index, which I think it's still offline now. It was taken out after January 20th. But many researchers kept that alive, and we are one of those groups trying to keep that alive. But that's used, right, to allocate federal funds, I mean, it's like across different types of natural disasters. Then the CDC has another, I mean, it's like index. We develop our own because we think that something related to the first panel today, that there are some conditions locally that make the incidence of different risk factor or vulnerability factors impact, I mean, differently on communities. And so we have our own, I mean, it's like Maria Paula is the lead on the project. It's called the BARP dashboard index, and it's on the dashboard, and people can, public officials and the public can access it and play around with those measures. And our hope, and this is what we're doing, is extend it over time and over space, because that would allow us to identify what are the conditions that make people more vulnerable or less resilient to different types of natural disasters.
I'm curious whether you both have insight on if and how the dynamic has changed in the last, 2 months, month and a half under the new administration, right? There, of course, is a lot in the news about the federal government seeing cuts in all different kinds of areas. I think we may not know the answer how that will affect FEMA's ability, for instance, to respond to a natural disaster, because we haven't had a major one since some of these cuts have started to happen. But have the events of the past few weeks changed the way y'all think about this in any way, about where the level of discussion this should be going? What kind of preparation should the state or the cities be making in a world with perhaps a weakened federal disaster response agency? Who?
We as researchers tend to look at the past to see what may come. I mean, we're still too early, to call. We know that this is going to have an impact on the ability of agencies like FEMA, the CDC, and others, to respond to needs of individuals. One thing we identify, in the past, 2017 during Harvey, 2020 during COVID, and so on, is that we have many programs, right? It's like that if you don't put, feet on the ground, it's really hard for the target populations, to uptake those programs, right? So that's key, right? It's like we tend to call these hard to reach populations for some reason, right? We can identify with them with data, we know where they reside, but it's really hard to get them, right? To engage in those programs. What I can say based on what we observe is that making public service something that people do not value because we're not providing value to it will create, an inability to bring up those individuals to work for those agencies that are needed to reach these populations. And that's my biggest concern with this space. We build agencies because we think they know better at the areas where they're there. And we want experts and people who value public service to be there. If you start, I mean, it's like cursing at them and thinking that they are of no value or pushing them out, it's going to be hard to bring in the new generations of public leaders to office, and that's going to be reflected in our inability to react to these processes.
So y'all have built this dashboard. It has identified areas. It's mainly in the Houston area right now, right? Of those areas that seem particularly vulnerable. What's the next step then? What should governments or universities or nonprofits be doing with this information in order to be more prepared for the next storm or disaster that comes?
I think expanding it to larger areas would be ideal, and also combining it with our survey results and more localized data, like gathered through surveys and through like interviews, like being able to combine those two, like the publicly available data with more qualitative data within the same place. That will be ideal, and that's what we're working on, expanding in our dashboard.
And the second stage here is that we're good with the data identifying where the population we target programs are. The next step, you have to get buy-in to those communities, right? I mean, to engage those targets, I mean, to taking in. I mean, that's the point we're trying to bring to all our partners, right? Nonprofit organizations, government agencies, and so on, to say that your program is targeting this population. If you compare the people who participate in the program, it's just the tip of the iceberg of that population. So how do we get to the rest of the community? Requires, I mean, it's like a complete different approach on how we engage those communities. You have to work with local leadership. I mean, communities, I mean, it's like one thing that we want people to understand. The government can do a lot of stuff that communities cannot, right? But in the absence of government, communities do respond. I mean, they get organized, right? So the key now is bridging, right, that gap. I mean, it's like connecting the resources that the governments can put together to the communities that already exist, that allow those programs to have a wider reach. And that's what we're hoping that would happen here.
Yeah, y'all have talked about kind of training communities to respond to disasters. What does that look like? What are you trying to teach them in order to be more prepared for that?
I think that teaching about, like, first, understanding differences in demographics in the state is key. Like, for example, we have a very young state in terms of population. People are younger, but one of the findings from our surveys is that, for example, cooling centers during extreme heat events, we asked them about their knowledge about them, and elder were more informed about them, and over 50% of the total respondents didn't know about their existence of these cooling centers. So they're not informed. So that means that probably governments and emergency preparedness people are not reaching out the audience in the way they should. So training should be also targeted to these different demographics within the state.
Okay, very good. And is this a harder challenge in Texas, where there is a lot of reluctance to talk about climate change? There's a lot of reluctance to acknowledge the dangers. Does it become harder to get that message across to leaders in the communities in that because of that?
So I think that leadership understands that these types of extreme weather events, natural disasters, are more frequent. I mean, it's like you don't have to believe in climate change being man-made. I mean, it's like to realize that that's the case, right? But that's the symptom. I mean, it's like, so even if you don't want to deal with I mean, it's like with the cost, I mean, it's like, which might be longer term and not within the typical politician's time horizon. I mean, it's like, right, because also it's costly and sometimes we don't want to put the resources there. So even if we leave aside whether or not we're contributing, right, to these events, I mean, it's like happening, they are happening. I mean, it's like, and so I think in that sense, what the message we want to bring about is that let's not let politics get in the way. I mean, it's like, so these issues are impacting, I mean, it's like a whole swath of the population, irrespective whether you're liberal or conservative, right? So the solutions are going to be very similar to both, right? And we know what works. I mean, it's like, so the key here is that we need to be able, I mean, it's like to put the resources where it makes our communities more resilient and more prepared, and also trying to identify how to bring up those who are more vulnerable. I mean, it's like, and forget about the language. I mean, it's like, this is it's not an issue about semantics here. I mean, right? I mean, it's like, and again, you don't have to believe that climate change is man-made. I mean, it's like, right? I mean, it's like what you have to understand is that there's more extreme heat events, there's more extreme cold events, there's more flooding, more tornadoes. I mean, it's like more hurricanes, right? And we need to deal with those.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me like another challenge, sort of apolitical challenge, is just the variety of disasters that a community could face. You know, we have Hurricane Harvey. The state really comes together and puts out a big report about what we can do, and then the next disaster is a extreme winter storm, right? You know, I think about this in the LA wildfires, where everyone's like, everyone knew that there were going to be wildfires. Why weren't they doing more? But it's like they also knew there could be earthquakes. They also knew, you know, all different kinds of things that could happen. And sometimes it feels like we're sort of fighting the last war instead of looking forward. I mean, how can we not just get sort of overwhelmed by all the different possible calamities that could happen? I mean, all these things cost money to prepare for.
And we are actually. That's the thing. So the motto after Harvey was Houston Strong, right? Following the Texas storm. The motto after Beryl, I mean, it's like last year was not that. I mean, right? I mean, it's like, so you see the reaction from the community. So communities are getting worn down. I mean, it's like about the occurrence of these events and the inability to be ready for the next one. So to give you an example, I mean, it's like during the extreme cold event and the blackouts, I mean, the studies that we looked at is that people I mean, it's like there's variance in the willingness to contribute. I mean, it's like the investments that will be necessary to make the grid more resilient, right? But the people who experienced long blackouts in our studies were less willing to contribute because they realized, why would I throw money at a place where I cannot trust, and these are the people, the government and the utilities, right, to deliver, right? I know that some of my neighbors did not feel, I mean, it's like blackouts. They're more willing to contribute because they want to, I mean, suffer what I suffer, but I'm giving up. I mean, it's like, so I'll fend for myself. And that's the worst way, I mean, to approach these issues, where we need to pull our efforts together.
That's another finding from our recent surveys, is that people are preparing more with individual strategies like stockpiling, buying a generator, than relying on community strategies like reaching out to neighbors or having a network prepared before the event. So they're getting more of these individual preparedness strategies, and through time they're preparing more. So we asked this question in 2021, and we found that around 30% of the respondents did not prepare for the hurricane season, while we asked that in 2024, and I think less than 10% responded to that. So yeah, people are preparing more. And
But one point about this, we can prepare individually, but some elements of preparedness require collective effort, right? Because the economies of scales, right? I mean, it's like to allowing the water to flow. I mean, right? I mean, it's like, right? Or keeping, I mean, it's like the distribution power lines up. I mean, right? I mean, so these require, the individual effort is not going to resolve those issues. Right? I mean, and that's the point where we have to realize that we're in it together.
Okay, we're coming up toward the end of our time, so I want to ask one last question. We are in the middle of a legislative session here in Texas. Major decisions are being made about how to allocate billions of dollars. From your perch, from the research that you have done, if you could tell lawmakers to invest, or maybe it's not even a financial investment, to do this one thing this session to make our cities more resilient, what would you focus your energy on?
I would focus on the reliability of the electricity grid. I mean, it's like that. I think it's one of the most important. It's one that's created most of the losses and damages to our communities, both, I mean, extreme heat and cold. But the second part that they can do, and because fewer resources, is sharing and creating and sharing information about, I mean, it's like how to better prepare, I mean, it's like for the next natural disasters to come.
Is there something, one of the big conversations right now about the grid, right, is making sure that we have enough power to, meet the demand that's going up. Is that the area that you're thinking about there?
That's one of the areas. I mean, it's like making, I mean, it's like it's like electricity production system, I mean, more resilient to extreme weather. Now, I mean, if the extreme weather pushes consumers to demand more electricity, right? I mean, we have to keep increasing on that. But the second is the distribution of power. I mean, so I think I mentioned it in the first session, and comes from the blueprint. Our electricity grid was designed 140 years ago, right? For a very different environment. I mean, in the way we produce electricity, right? We're producing electricity in many places that are not connected to the grid. Some areas of our state have negative electricity prices, right, for renewables at some time of the day because they cannot get that electricity into the grid, right? So we have to be more creative in the ways we address these issues.
Would you have a recommendation for the
Yeah,
legislature?
in addition to what Pablo said, and we mentioned this in the blueprint as well, is developing more localized measures to address these climate issues and environmental issues. I think that's key, and providing data.
Yeah, what's the barrier to that? Do you think is it financial? Is it just organizing? What would need to happen to help that work begin?
I think both, like financial, but also financial part is key, but also I forgot what I was going to say, but yeah, I think both are important. But one barrier is that like the communication between local governments and the state government.
Real quickly, how can people find the dashboard that we've been talking about today?
Oh, at the Hobby School webpage, VRAP dashboard.
So for Hobby School BARP dashboard, and you'll find it.
Excellent. Well, thank you both for being here today. Excellent
Thank
conversation.
you so
Thank
much.
you.
Appreciate it.